Yeah. Okay. Let's just set our motivation for the session. First, sorry, let me get adjusted here on my seat. And put it on gallery view. Okay, so sit comfortably on your cushion and yeah, check your posture. Mm, let's meditate for a couple minutes. Focus our minds and generate and prepare our minds to generate a positive motivation. So as you check through the points of your posture, see that your body's relaxed and comfortable. And then focus your attention on an object of meditation and do placement meditation for about 1 minute to focus your attention. Mhm. So then to generate a positive motivation, and think about yeah, why you're engaging in this session. And yeah, as it relates to yourself, as it relates to others, um, and as it relates to your longest term and highest aspirations for yourself and for others. And then also, so as you generate your motivation, also, yeah, try to remember, well, I mean, the problems and difficulties of yourself and others, and the possibility of relieving those, and then also the potential of oneself and others for well-being and happiness, and actualizing that. And but then also try to uh, think of everything as much as you can as a dependent arising and as being in nature, empty of existing from its own side, um, and to whatever degree of understanding you have about that. Try to remember that, um, yeah, the nature of everything being independent arising. Mm. So within that, spend a minute or so generating a positive motivation for the session. Mm. And then if you like, finally, you can visualize, if you like, you can visualize Shakyamuni Buddha in the space before you or other objects of refuge. And then I'll recite the refuge and bodhicitta prayer in English 3 times. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the virtues I create through explaining the Dharma and other perfections, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the virtues I create through explaining the Dharma, may I become enlightened in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the virtues I create through studying the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, so then we can start. So the actual session today, we're looking at, so we're in this module, we're doing this module on the wisdom of emptiness. So we're doing this this module, I think it's module 6, the way we're setting it out, in Discovering Buddhism on the wisdom of emptiness, and we're going to cover it in basically 6 sessions, and this is the 3rd session. So the previous 2 sessions, there was one just kind of introducing the whole idea of emptiness and how, emptiness and why it's important, first of all, especially to become free from suffering. It's important to realize emptiness in order to counteract and eliminate the ignorance, which is the source of the root cause of all suffering. And then where it comes up in the Lamrim, in the middle scope and in the great scope. So in the middle scope, in relation to eliminating the sources of one's own suffering, then one engages in the practice of the 3 higher trainings. The higher training of morality has a basis for the higher training of concentration, has a basis for the higher training in wisdom, by which we actually uproot the causes of samsara. And then the emptiness comes up in the great scope, in the context of becoming fully enlightened in order to benefit other sentient beings. And the Bodhisattva's practice of the 6 perfections, the perfection of generosity, morality, joyous effort, patience, then joyous effort, concentration, and the wisdom. The last, yeah. And then in the 2nd section, we discussed the last week. So one of the we discussed identifying the object of negation. And so when we talk about emptiness, we have to clearly identify we're talking about empty of what, right? Because it doesn't mean nothingness. It's not nihilism, but rather empty of things existing in a way that they falsely appear to us, and we falsely grasp at things existing in that way. So the ignorance, which is the fundamental cause of suffering, is a grasping at things. It's an ignorance, a specific ignorance, which grasps at things as existing in a way that they actually don't. So when we talk about emptiness, we're talking about things being empty of existing in that way. So you might have, I think after last week's session, I had Mary Ellen send out just a table with terms. If you looked at that, then that's, maybe, I'm not sure we'll look at that today, but maybe. But those terms, like basically on the left column is things that don't exist, and on the right column is things that do exist. Because there's a lot of, part of learning about emptiness is learning about a lot of different kind of new terms. And it can become confusing, but to try to simplify, because there are a lot of different terms that are basically synonyms. But when we talk about the object of negation, then especially there's things inherently existing from its own side, concrete existence or reified existence or true existence. So those all mean more or less the same thing, but that's what was being negated. Yep. So last week we spoke about the object of negation. So identifying the object of negation is the first step in a process to realize emptiness called the 4-point analysis. 4-point analysis. So, and that's the main way I've laid out the sessions to go through this kind of 4-point analysis, more or less. So, when we talk about emptiness, then and realizing emptiness, we talk about with regard to two kinds of objects: persons, people, and not so it includes humans, animals, ghosts, devas, any kind of sentient being, and then with regard to objects that are not sentient beings, inanimate objects, which also includes things which are part of us, like our body, our mind, and then things which are external to any sentient being's continuum, like a table, or a computer, or a house, so forth. So, I guess before we talk about the emptiness of those, we should, well, it's because we grasp, there's ignorance grasping at a self of persons and inherently exists, so we can grasp at our person, our own self, as inherently existent or existing from its own side. And we can grasp at other people as existing from their own side, or animals as existing from their own side. So that's all ignorance grasping at a self of persons. So here when we say self, we mean inherently existent self, a kind of self that doesn't exist. So we have ignorance grasping at self of persons. And then when we grasp at like computers or tables as existing from their own side, or houses as existing from their own side, that's grasping at a self of phenomena. So phenomena meaning things other than persons in that case. So because we have those two kinds of ignorance, grasping at a self of persons, or an inherently existent person, or a self of phenomena, an inherently existent phenomena, then we have two kinds of wisdom counteracting those two kinds of ignorance. So the wisdom counteracting the ignorance, grasping a self of persons, is the wisdom realizing the selflessness of persons, or realizing the emptiness of persons. Right. So that's when that kind of wisdom realizing emptiness comes about when we analyze ourself or another person to see whether they inherently exist or not, and we find they don't. They're empty of that kind of existence. So then we realize the emptiness or selflessness of. So those are another set of synonyms: emptiness, selflessness. So we realize the selflessness of persons. And then when we analyze other phenomena, so again, those that belong to our continuum, like our body or our mind, or those that are external to our continuum, like tables or computers. So when we analyze to see if those things exist from their own side in the way they appear, we find they don't, they're empty of inherent existence, then that the wisdom realizing that is called the wisdom realizing emptiness or selflessness of phenomena, right? Wisdom realizing the selflessness of phenomena. So, one way, especially one way to establish either of these, to generate either kind of wisdom realizing selflessness of persons, or wisdom realizing selflessness of phenomena, there's different kinds of analysis. We have to analyze how things exist and then arrive at this conclusion: they're empty of inherent existence. So one kind of, and there's different types of analysis, but one of the most simple is called the 4-point analysis. And so in that, there's 4 steps. The first is identifying the object of negation. Then the second is, so we'll go through the rest of it today. That's what we did last week, identifying the object of negation. Then the next 3 steps are identifying the 2 possibilities, then establishing that, the person is not the same as the aggregates, and then establishing that the person is not different from the aggregates. So that's what we'll go through, those last 3 steps today. So now I'll jump to my PowerPoint slide. Oh yeah, I'm in the right place already. Okay, so here we are, session 3. And I'll start with this quotation by Nagarjuna. And this is a quotation that His Holiness Dalai Lama mentions almost every session these days, but especially if he's explaining anything about dependent arising or emptiness, he'll always quote these 2 verses. And this is the first verse is about how to analyze whether the person, how the person exists. And then the second is saying basically to use the same type of analysis to analyze how phenomena exist. And this is, yeah, it's sort of the main analysis, thinking about emptiness. So so the main idea here is that every phenomena, everything that exists is composed of parts. It consists of a collection of parts. Remember, I think I was talking about last week how, we look at a person as a person, we can easily see we're made up of parts. We have physical parts, our arms, legs, head, ears. Although here it talks about our physical parts in terms of the elements, how we have, aspects of earth, like the solidity, water, our liquidity, fire, our heat, and wind, the movement within the body. Or you can think of, more sort of modern terms. We're made up of cells. Those cells are made up of molecules, and those molecules are made up of atoms. Atoms are made up of electrons, protons, and so forth. So we have physical parts. And then we have non-physical parts because we have a mind also. So what are the parts of our mind? Obviously, it's not like physical things in space. Our brain is not our mind, remember? So mind is something non-physical, but our mind, it exists through time, in connected segments through time. Well, one way our mind has parts is we have different kinds of consciousness. We have eye sense consciousness, arising and dependent upon our eyes. Ear sense consciousness, which hears sounds and depends upon our ears. And then body sense consciousness, which experience tactile sensations like heat and cold. So those are different kinds of consciousness. And then we have experiences of pleasure, experiences of, pleasant experiences, unpleasant experiences. And then we have mental consciousness where we think about, so we can divide up according to what object we're focusing on and how we're grasping at that object. Those are all parts of mind. But then any instance of consciousness, it has a duration through time. So we can divide up in moments of time, former and later moments, the former giving rise to the later, and each, in a continual kind of flow. Yeah. So in short, physical things, mental things are all made up of parts. And permanent things are a little more difficult, but we can come back to that later. So, but the basic way of analysis here is because everything is made of parts, then anything that exists, the way it exists is it's labeled upon its parts. So when we look, so like us as a person, we have a collection of parts, body and mind, and then on that collection of parts, we label I, right? And it's through this process of labeling that we come into existence. Anything comes into existence. So we exist independence upon being imputed upon our basis of imputation, collection of parts. So when we search for the I, the person that exists, although it seems at first that when we search for, what essentially is anything. So here, just taking I, ourself as an example. When we search for the I, it seems at first like we should be able to find something precise, exactly what we are in essence, we can zoom in on. But instead, what happens is the very opposite. When we search for precisely what we are, all we find is a collection of things, each of which is not us, right? So we can search and find, maybe find, we zoom in and we can find our brain or our heart, our lungs, or some feelings or thoughts, but each of those is not us for different reasons. So, and then in that analysis, so that's the analysis that's being, kind of explained here in these verses. And so that analysis we can do with regard to ourselves as a person, and we can do the very same analysis with regard to, a laptop, a table, a country, a house, any other kind of phenomena. Because each of those phenomena, they are the same in being something labeled upon a collection of parts. And when we zoom in to find any of those parts is not that very phenomenal. Anyway, there's different permutations of that. As time allows, we'll discuss. But to look at these verses right now. So the first verse, a person is not earth, not water, not fire, not wind, not space, not consciousness, and not all of them. What person is there other than these? So, yep. So if we analyze to see what is the person. So to do, the meditation according to this verse more formally, first we would, like last week, get a sense of how we ordinarily appear to exist in different situations. When we're being falsely accused of having done something wrong and we feel defensive, when we feel suddenly afraid, or just when we're ordinarily sitting and turning the mind to see how we appear to exist to ourselves. And then so His Holiness says, and His Holiness, he recites these verses every day as part of his meditation. He recommends anyone who wants to be a student of his do the same. But His Holiness often advises where it says in the first verse, a person, that we insert our own name, right? So for me, when I recite these verses every day, I say Lexok is not earth, not water, not fire. So that's more effective, no? Because you want to do the analysis with relation to yourself. And then in the second verse where it says, just as a person is not real, I say, just as Lexok is not real due to being a composite of 6 constituents and so forth. So the way we do this analysis is first we get a sense of how we ordinarily appear, like we did last week, and then we check, so I mean, here it says is not the earth, but we have to check, is it the earth? Is Lexok the earth? Is, ourself, are we earth? So a person is not the earth. So here earth is referring to all the solid elements of our body, the solid things like our teeth, our bones, and then the solidity of, our tissue, our skin, our muscles, and each of the cells has a solid aspect. And then the not water refers to the liquid aspect. So liquidity, any of the fluids in our body. So we can see that, our bones, for example, our teeth, our joints, and our muscles, they're not us. I'm not those. Or water, any of the fluids in our body, that's not me. Then the warmth, the fire. So the warmth and the digestion and the kind of chemical catalysts that, or I'm not sure, catalyst or transformations that produce nutrients and growth and sort of transformation of food and other substances in the body. So all those, that's kind of fire. When we talk about fire, it means that kind of combustion, transformation that produces heat and energy. So all of that, warmth of our body is not us. And then not wind. So wind refers to movement, lightness and movement, and the ability, for movement. So even the kind of physical movement within our body, that's also not me. I possess that. Then space just refers to empty space. We need, well, think about sort of atomic structure of atoms. They're mostly made of space. Things that appear solid actually mostly made of space or composed of space. And then within the body, there's also empty cavities, in our intestines and our abdomen. So that also, any of the space cavities in our body and our sinuses, that's also not us. So we're not any of those physical things. So then we might think, well, I'm consciousness. I'm essentially mind. consciousness, which is a good candidate. So it says, so we're not consciousness. Again, because consciousness is something we possess. If we were a mind, we wouldn't have, no one could see us or touch us or hear us. We wouldn't have any of the physical functions we have if we were just mind. And then we might think, well, okay, I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, but I'm all of them kind of lumped together, the whole collection of body and mind. That's a very strong candidate for self. Here it says, I'm not all of them. It doesn't give any reason, but the reason is because that also is, that's the basis upon which we impute I. The collection of body and mind is the basis upon which we impute self. And because that whole collection of body and mind is also something we possess, right? Anyway, we'll come back to faults about that later if we assert that we are the collection of body and mind. But one of the faults would be, though, it couldn't be the case that then our body and mind are things that we have, that we possess, because they would be just exactly the same thing. But for now, though, so we're not any the elements of water, fire, and wind. We're not space. We're not consciousness. We're not all of them together. So then, and then the second is the person other than these. So if we think, well, maybe I'm something just other than those, separate from those. But then when we look separately from those, we take, our body and mind away, and then look for ourself as being something separate from those. We can't find anything to point to say, that's me. So then we're left with the inevitable conclusion that actually we don't exist as something, truly existent or existing from its own side or inherently existent. So we don't exist in that solid, concrete, real way that we appear to initially. And then the next verse. So we do the same analysis with regard to other things. Just as a person is not real, due to why is a person not real? Because it's a composite of the six constituents. The six constituents being earth, water, fire, wind, and then space and consciousness. We add to the four elements, we add space and consciousness. So because we're a composite of the six constituents, therefore we're not real, real meaning existing from our own side. And then the third line, so, or it means likewise, each of the six constituents also is not real due to being a composite. So if we take any of the six constituents, so let's take consciousness, the fifth one. Actually, sixth one, consciousness. It also is not real from its own side. So if we search, like we can search for our own consciousness or our own mind. And then again, what we find is a collection of parts. We find, there's an eye consciousness seeing, seeing a lamp, the sound consciousness hearing the voice, a physical consciousness feeling like a sensation of coolness, a mental consciousness trying to think of, emptiness. But none of those is consciousness, like the whole consciousness of which all the others are instances, right? Consciousness means, general consciousness, or if we think my consciousness is general my consciousness, and then every individual mind I have is an instance of that. So when we look for that, we can't find, we can't find it. All we find is instances that are parts of it. And it's the same with regard to, earth. We look for the earth element in our body. We can't find the earth element in our body. All we find is things which are instances of that. So that, what does that indicate? Not that it doesn't exist, but that it's not real. It doesn't exist from its own side. It's a dependent arising. Anyway, well, I just wanted to introduce these kind of ideas with regard to these verses. And then come back again at the end. But for now, I want to go through these 5 kind of headings. So first, to sort of review what is to be refuted or negated, and then the next 3 steps in analysis. What are the full set of possibilities? Why the person and the aggregates cannot be inherently the same, and then why the person and the aggregates cannot be inherently different, and then a conclusion. So first, This is basically a review again, what is to be refuted or negated. But I wanted to focus more specifically on how the person actually exists. Um, so, first of all, the person or the I that in fact does exist. So there is the conventionally existent person um, that does exist is merely imputed upon its basis of imputation, the aggregates. So remember the 5 aggregates. Um, when we talk about aggregates, we'll be talking about that a lot this session. We're talking about essentially our body and our mind. So, but there's the mind we can divide up into 4 different aggregates. So our body is called the form aggregate. And then the second aggregate is that of feeling. So pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings. Um, those are the second aggregate. And then the third is discrimination. When we think, oh, this is a time to get up. This is a time to have breakfast, or this is a computer. This is a table. This is me. This is them. This is good. This is bad. All these kind of conceptual discriminations. Those are the third aggregate of discrimination. And then the fourth aggregate is all the other mental factors. So like intention, an intention to do something, memory of past events, imagination about the future, or something we want to create. So basically all the other, and then let me see, what's another one? Yeah, different kinds of wisdom, wisdom analyzing emptiness. So all the other kind of mental functions, except for the main minds, right? Which are the fifth aggregate. So the fifth aggregate is consciousness. So that means primarily our mental consciousness, or also the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, sense consciousness. But the main minds, the minds that merely observe their object, and then there's other mental factors that accompany them. So it's not so important to know all about the 5 aggregates here, but the main thing is to know that they're all included within body and mind, and that they are basis upon which we impute person. Right. So when we talk about the aggregates that are basis of imputation for a person, we're talking about all the parts that make us up as a person. So the way the person exists, in fact does exist, is as something merely imputed upon its basis of imputation, the aggregates or the body and mind of the person. So and then in more detail, causes give rise to a collection of parts having the capacity to function as a person, right? So causes being, our continuum of consciousness coming from past lives, our karma, which causes us to take rebirth, the activation of that karma by craving and grasping, and then our parents coming together in, sexual union and making conception possible, and then, developing in the womb and so forth. So, for many different causes and conditions come together, and then we have this conjunction of our body and mind at the moment of conception, and then that grows, and then upon that gradually is labeled person. So then, upon this collection of parts, the aggregates of body and mind, then conceptual consciousness labels person or I, and therefore a person, exists, comes into existence. So there is no person existing from its own side or inherently apart from causes and parts and labeling, right? So separate from, if you separate out that whole story of causes and then parts coming together and then labeling, completely, apart from that, separate from that, if you look for a person existing somehow completely independently from that, you can't find any person who exists completely apart from that. So the person that does exist exists as a independence upon a chain of events, causes and conditions, and then a set of parts, and then upon those parts labeling the person. And then finally, beyond being imputed upon its basis of imputation, so the person it does not exist. The person does not exist in the slightest way, more substantially than that, or more concretely, from its own side or by its own power, right? So And so that's what's to be negated. So, however, so although that's the way the person exists, right, it doesn't appear to like that to us when we don't analyze. When we don't analyze, it appears as if there's just one, solid person. They're just I am just there. I am just as I am, and I am just like that, just by its own power, without having to refer to or depend upon anything else. That's just how I exist. I just am there, but almost by the power of just being, by the power of just being, the person I am, without reference to, without depending upon anything else. So, however, so meaning, although that's the way we exist is as was just explained, independence upon parts, dependence upon causes, independence upon mental imputation, there appears to be an inherently existent I, a self, or person. And then, as we discussed last week, especially at times when we have strong, disturbing emotions arise, like when we're being falsely accused, or when we feel very attached to something, craving something, when we feel jealous, when we feel afraid, and so forth. So the person appears to exist from its own side, and then not only it appears, but we grasp at that as being real. We assume that, or we take that, we perceive that, or we grasp at ourselves as actually existing in that way. And then same with other people, other phenomena. They appear to exist, in and of their own right, from their own side, and we grasp at that as being real. So that's the ignorance. So this inherently existent person that appears and that we grasp at as existing, although it does not exist, is the object of negation, right? So like we discussed last week, and the person appearing to exist from their own side, and then we grasp at that. So that person, that person that we grasp at, well, you could say the person that exists from their own side, that we grasp at, that's the object of negation. So it's one of the most difficult things to separate out the person that does exist from the person that doesn't exist, right? Because they always appear as being mixed together, right? It's never like one appears without the other. So because there's a dependently arising person that does exist, right? We're a dependently arising phenomena. But the way we appear as if we're not dependent arising, as if we exist just from our own side, inherently separate from, and not depending upon anything else. So that person that we grasp at that as existing, that doesn't exist, right? That's the object of negation. So again and again and again, we have to try to do the first step, trying to cause the object of negation to appear and then identify it. Okay, so then how do we analyze though? Once we have some sense of the object of negation, the next step, the analysis, is to look at the set of two possibilities. So this is a kind of logic in 5 steps here, is that anything that exists is either singular or plural, right? So just think about that. Is it true that anything that exists is either one or many, singular or plural? Like you yourself as a person, are you one person or many people? Right? Obviously, we're just one person. Say, I don't know, the cast of Hamilton, the Broadway show, the cast of Hamilton. Is that one person or many people? Obviously, it's many people, right? It's not one. Or think about, I don't know, your laptop or your phone that you're looking at. Is that one thing or many things? It's just one thing, right? So anything that exists, it's either, a singular thing or a plural thing. Anyway, we can, yeah. there's always more kind of discussion and detail to go into, but for now I'll just gloss over and go to the next point is anything that exists. So similarly, anything that exists is either one with, same, or different from the aggregates that are the basis of imitation of a person. So let's just, before we look at the aggregates, let's just think about here. So I'll use a prop here, my watch. So just to make this point quickly, so here's my watch, my table. So we can divide up, think of everything that exists in the world. We can divide into two groups. Those are the same as this watch, and those that are different from this watch, right? And by the same here, I mean those that are exactly the same. They are one with this watch. So this watch is the only thing in the world that is one with this watch. Everything else, every other watch is different from this watch. Every other thing that exists, you know, it's a computer, a person, a table, a house, is different from the watch. So with regard to any object, anything that exists, we can divide up all phenomena that exist into two groups. Those that are exactly the same as that, and those that are different from that object. Right? So think of you yourself as a person. You know, you are, you know, you, in short. Everybody else, every other person is not you. Right? They exist, but they're not you. And then every other phenomena that's not a person, whether it's a chair or a table, is also something other than you. Right? So just as in relation to this watch, everything in the universe can be divided up into things that are it and things that are not it. Then in relation to oneself as a person, everything that exists can be divided into two groups. Those that are exactly the same as you, there's only one instance, you. And then those that are other, or different from you, or other than you. So that's the logic that we use to establish that there's only two possibilities. So what we'll come back to, I'll share the screen again, is that if a person inherently exists, so we do the same analysis with regard to the aggregates. So the collection of parts, our body and mind, upon which we're imputed. So we take that as the object, with which we divide up everything in the world. So with regard to the aggregates, the collection of our body and mind upon which we're imputed, then everything in the world either is that collection or is not, or is other than, it's different from it, right? So, right, so first we have that, right? And then, so then we can say um, if something exists, maybe I shouldn't have shared my screen so soon. So if something exists, then it has to be part of one of those two groups. Either it has to be the aggregates of my body and mind, or be something different from them. There's only two possibilities. Just as, you know, everything, come back to the watch, everything that, if something exists, it has to either be this watch or something different from the watch. Right? There's only those two possibilities for existence. So we do the same with regard to the collection of our body and mind, or aggregates. If something exists, it must either be my aggregates of body and mind, or separate from them, or different from them. Right? There's only two possibilities. There's no third possibility. So here, then we come to the next step, is that if if something inherently exists, right? If it has inherent existence, then it must either be inherently the same as my aggregates, or inherently different. So we come back to the watch, we can start. If something inherently exists, or exists from its own side, it must inherently exist as being the same as my watch, or something different, because there's only those two possibilities. Because just as if something exists, it has to be the same as this watch or something different from the watch. If something inherently exists, then it has to be inherently the same as the watch or inherently different from the watch. So we do the same with regard to our aggregates. If something inherently exists, it has to be inherently the same as a collection of my body and mind, or inherently different from that collection. There's no third possibility. So we could spend a whole session just talking about that and trying to work out that logic, but it's, yeah, it's very logical. It's so, yeah, think about it. But this is, I mean, emptiness is not something, this is one of the reasons it's not just something you can just kind of immediately understand completely. There's many different steps to do the analysis, but it's not that complicated. It just takes a little bit of time to think about and make sure there's no loopholes, right? That the logic is kind of watertight, or airtight. So that's what it says in the third, number 3 here. If a person inherently or truly exists, then the person, it must be either inherently one with or inherently different from the aggregates. There's no third possibility, right? If the person is neither, and so what that entails, what that means is that if the person is neither inherently one with, nor inherently different from the aggregates, then it does not inherently exist, right? So just as if something, if something is neither one with this watch nor different from this watch, then it doesn't exist, right? So, like, think about, uh, yeah, I mean, like a flying pig, for example. We have to come up with example of a non-existent thing, right? So the pig that can fly at Mach 1, or the fly, anyway, it doesn't have to fly at Mach 1, just a flying pig is enough. But is that one with this watch? No. Is it something different from the watch? Right? If it's something different from the watch, we should be able to find it when we look for it. So everywhere we search, we can search the skies of the 7 continents, and we'll never find a flying pig anywhere. Or we might find a pig in an airplane. That probably exists. But is that a flying pig? No, here we mean a pig that can fly on its own. It's not just a passenger on a jet plane or something. So yeah, so that's something that doesn't, it's not one of the watch. It's also not different from the watch. You can't find it anywhere. But like, just think about, I don't know, a car. Is a car? Does it exist? Yeah. Is it one with the watch? No, it's something different from the watch, right? But if so is it the case if something is not either one with the watch or different from the watch, it doesn't exist? Yes. Um, anyway, you just think of, so that basic logic is not too difficult. Anything that exists, it's either, if you take any third thing like a watch or a person or a table, then it's anything that exists either has to be one with that, same as that, or different from that. There's no third possibility. That's the main logic here. And then, so we use that logic to check for when we the object of negation, right? The inherently existent person, to check if it exists. If it exists, it must, fall within one of these two possibilities, either being an inherently existent person that's inherently one with the aggregates, or inherently different from them. Those are the only two possibilities. If it's neither of those, then it doesn't exist. So then we look at the first possibility. Is it inherently one with the aggregates? So, and then the reasons why it cannot be, right? So why the person and the aggregates cannot be inherently the same. And there are 5 reasons here. Yeah, we won't have time to go through all of them, but to go through at least the first. So if they are inherently the same, then they cannot appear as two different things to the mind. I mean, because they would be exactly the same thing. They'd be completely inseparable. So then if they're inherently, if the inherently existent person or a person existing from its own side was the same as our aggregates, the same as the collection of our body and mind, then they wouldn't appear as two different things to the mind because they'd be exactly the same thing. Then there's a problem of number, there's a problem of possession, a problem of destruction, and a problem of functions. So we'll come back to those. But so here, oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. There. Yeah, maybe I just want to make this point a little bit more strongly before I go to the next slide. Is that what would it mean for for us? So think about last week when we meditated, and we get a sense of how we do appear to exist from our own side. When I think about I, the person, it seems like there's something kind of concrete, real, just there, just is, without reference to, without depending upon anything else. So if that person existed as if I assert, if I think that in fact what I am actually is the collection of body and mind. So if I assert that this person I am, it's the same as my body and mind. It's not something different, right? There's only two possibilities. Either it is the same as or one with my aggregates, or something different from the aggregates. So if I take the first and think it's the same as the aggregates, what it means is it has to be exactly the same as the aggregates. Just as, remember, when we divide up everything that exists in the world into either one with this watch, the same as this watch, or different, the only thing that's the same as this watch is this watch itself, right? So everything else is something different. So if the person inherently exists, if the inherently existent person, or the person existing from their own side, if they are the same as my aggregates, it means they are exactly the same, right? They are the aggregates. They're not something different in any way whatsoever, right? If they were, they'd be they'd be inherently different. They'd be totally disconnected and unrelated. So if they are the aggregates, then what is that? Then what are the problems that ensue if we say they are the aggregates? I just wanted to clarify there. If they are the aggregates, this means they are exactly the same. So first of all, there'd be a problem of number, right? Because the person, we think we're just one person, right? There's just one person. But the aggregates, they're a collection of many things. They're plural, they're many, right? So the person would become plural or many, just as the aggregates are, right? We have our body and mind. The aggregates is a collection of many parts, our body and mind, and then all the parts of our body, all the different parts of our mind. It's all those parts together. So those has many. There are many things, whereas the person is just one thing, right? So that's inconsistent. And then there would also be the problem that if the person that we are and the aggregates are one thing, and just as the person is one, the aggregates would all have to be just one thing, singular. So just as the person is singular, the aggregates would also have to be singular. So the aggregates would be singular, as is the person. So there's a problem in number. And then the problem of possession. So the person could not be the possessor of the aggregates because it would make no sense to say the person's aggregates from my mind. Yeah. So here, the reason is, if it's just like, come back to our simple example of the watch. If, sorry, keep it on the screen. So if we, it doesn't make sense to talk about the watch's watch, right? something, to have a possessor, someone who possesses something, and then something possessed, you have to have two different things, right? So because the watch is the same as itself, it can't possess itself. Just like you think about yourself as a person. Does it make sense to say, I am mine? I mean, maybe we say that. I don't know, do we ever say that? I'm not sure. But like, I belong to myself. When we say, if we do say that, it means kind of like we have some kind of sense of autonomy over ourselves. But are we literally a possession of ourselves? Like, to be something that belongs to me, it has to be something different from me, right? Not, it can't be the exact same thing as me. So, um, but we do feel like, and it does seem to be the case that, our body is a possession. Like, it's my hand, my head, my eyes, my arms, my legs, or my thoughts, my memories, my feelings. That all makes sense, right? So, but think about, if the person is the aggregates, is this collection of body and mind, then they are the exact same thing, right? So it no longer makes sense to talk about, my arms, my legs, because I am those things. No longer makes sense to talk about like my mind, because I am, that collection of body and mind. I am my mind. So clearly we're something separate we're something different from our body and our mind, our aggregates, right? One, because our aggregates are, in the first reason, because our aggregates are a collection of many things. But here, again, we have to be careful not to, and in my speech I just did, in to slip from talking about the object of negation, the inherently existent person, to talking about the ordinary person, right? Like the person that does exist. They're two different things, right? So, I mean, and we can do this analysis with regard to either, but we want to keep it just with regard to the object of negation, the inherently existent person. So if the inherently existent person is the aggregates, then it would become many things, because the aggregates are many things. So there would be many persons, which there's not, right? Or the aggregates would have to be one, a singular thing, as is the person, because they're the exact, they would be the exact same thing. So clearly they're not, because the aggregates are many, and the inherently existent person, if it exists, is just one thing. And then the second reason here is that if the inherently existent person were the aggregates, then we can no longer think of the two as being separate, right? Because they're just the exact same thing. So it wouldn't make sense to talk about my body, my mind, um, and so forth. So that's the second reason they're not the same. Yeah. And then I'll just mention another two reasons. So yeah, so the fourth, the problem of destruction. So it would be the case if the inherently existent person is the body and mind, then when that collection of body and mind is destroyed at the time of death, right? So when at the time of death, our mind separates from our body disintegrates, becomes dust, and our mind goes on to some kind of future existence. So that collection, it disintegrates, it separates, and no longer, the collection of our body and mind no longer exists. So if the person was the collection of body and mind, then it would mean that as a person, we cease to exist at the time of death. So there would be no rebirth, no past and future lives, because we would cease at the time, completely cease at the time of death. Also, karma wouldn't function. Or it would mean that the whole collection of body and mind, they take rebirth, which leads to a lot of other problems. So, and then there's the problem of function, which is that if the person were, for example, a mind, then it couldn't be seen by other people, or they couldn't touch it. We couldn't walk or sit or eat or any of the physical things we do. Or if the person were the body, then it couldn't think or perceive, or have feelings or thoughts and so forth. So those are the problems if they're one. And then the problems if the inherently existent person it cannot be inherently different from the aggregates, right? Why? Because basically, the main is the problem of findability. So, so if the inherently existent person is different from the aggregates, it would mean that completely without referring to, without depending upon our body and mind whatsoever, we should be able to find the person. So remember, we did this and we looked for this in when we meditated at the end of last session. We tried to, imagine putting your body and mind, in one room, and then in a different room, the other side of the house, you look for the I. You can't find. What can you find? Can you find anything you can point to and say that is the person, apart from, independently from the body and mind? No, not at all. So if the inherently existent person, the object of negation, existed as something other than the body and mind, then it should be findable. It should be findable as something completely, inherently separate. It's completely separate. But we can't find that at all. It doesn't exist. So then the conclusion has to be then the person doesn't exist in that way. There is no inherently existent person. There is no person existing from its own side, independent from the body and mind. Why? Because that kind of person, inherently existent person, is not one with the aggregates. It's also not different from the aggregates. And there's no third possibility, right? So therefore, the only, logical conclusion is it doesn't exist whatsoever. So then that finding of non-existence is emptiness of the person. So now, any questions before we have a break? Now we'll have a short break, and then we'll do some meditation, and then we'll have a discussion group. But if there's anything that appears like right away that you're like, I didn't understand what that means, you can ask now. I'll try to clear it up. Otherwise, we'll have more chance for question and answer at the end of the discussions. Okay. Jorge?
Hello, good morning to you. So, just to clarify, maybe I know I don't understand completely, but you're telling me that I'm not real and I don't exist because nothing inherent about me exists physically or mentally. Is that correct?
No. That's not. Yeah, you're mixing up the when you say I'm not real, I don't exist, you're referring to just the ordinary person, Jorge. Right?
Okay.
So you exist. Otherwise, you couldn't raise your hand and ask a question. And
Okay, just making sure because I guess I don't. I have zero understanding about the idea of I guess existence in general.
okay, so the way you exist is as a dependently arising thing, right? You exist independent upon having parts, all the parts of your body, all the parts of your mind, and those have all arisen from causes, conditions, and then upon those you label I. I, Jorge, or I, Lexel, or whoever, I, the person. That's how you exist. But then, is that how you appear? Is that how we appear to exist? What, in all situations? Mostly not. We don't appear to exist like that. So then that's the importance of identifying the object of negation, right? So at the beginning of the analysis, we have to identify what are we negating is not, the ordinary I that exists and functions. And obviously, we're here, we're doing stuff, we're talking, thinking, walking, eating, sleeping. So there's an I, there is a person that does all that stuff. But the question is, how do we appear to ourselves, especially when we have afflictive emotions arise? So the way we appear is as if, so think again about, when someone accuses you of doing something wrong, then how do you appear at that time? It appears like there is this real I, it just is there. without depending on what body, without depending on mind, without depending on mental mutation. It just is real there from its own side, right? So what we're negating, what I'm saying doesn't exist, is that an I existing from its own side, without depending upon anything else. That's what doesn't exist.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Okay, if there's no other questions jumping up right away, let's take a 5-minute break now and then resume. Okay. So let's resume now. I just put in the chat box, I put the 3 questions for discussion for your reference later. I'm not sure if they remain. Do you remember, Urs? Do they remain in the chat box when we break out to discussion rooms? When we're in the breakout rooms? Do we have access to them?
I would think so. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. Anyway, try to have a look at those sometime between now and when we have discussions
Right.
and try to remember, yeah, or write them down or something. But now let's do some meditation for, I don't know, 15 minutes or so. So we'll do basically the same meditation as we did last week at the end of the session. We'll do this 4-point analysis. First, trying to identify the object of negation, how we ordinarily sort of appear as existing from our own side. And then reflecting on the 2 possibilities that if we do exist in that way, we must either be one with or separate from the aggregates. And then checking each of those 2 possibilities, checking whether it makes sense for us to be one or the same with the aggregates, and whether it makes sense to be different from the aggregates. And then hopefully finding we're neither of those, and just resting in emptiness at the end. Okay, so first get comfortable in meditation posture. And just let everything go and focus your mind on your breath or your mind or something else. Just do placement meditation for a few moments. So then let's think about a time either when we felt falsely accused of something, or we felt defensive, or a time also we felt very kind of elated and attached to something, or jealous, or or very attached to something. So try to think about something, a very specific situation. And then with part of your mind, observe how you seem to exist in that time, how you appear to exist. And especially, does it seem like you exist from your own side, just in and out, like there is an I, just concrete, real, just there, without depending upon anything else? Okay, so it's that sense of I that is seeming where it seems to exist from its own side that we're trying to negate, right? So if later in the analysis as we're meditating, if you lose a sense of what you're looking for, then go back to this step, right? And try to get a sense of how you ordinarily seem to appear as existing from your own side. Get a clear sense of that and then go back to the analysis, right? So it's not just not the interdependently arising self we're trying to negate. Rather, it's this false sense of self where we seem to exist from our own side. So just spend a couple more moments getting a sense of how that does appear, how we seem to exist just independently from our own side. And then we'll go to the next step. Just one more thing, I guess, to add is that usually whenever an afflictive emotion arises, be it anger, be it anger, jealousy, pride, there's always this reified, this concrete sense of self. It's always there. So we can look at any time an afflictive emotion is arising and look at how we appear to exist. And you'll find this. We appear to exist as just from our own side, just there, concrete, real, inherently existing. So we have to kind of keep track of that, the way the self appears as concrete, real. So if it exists in that way, then is it true? It must either be one with the aggregates, the collection of our body and mind, or different from them. So it must either be exactly the same, one with them, or something different from them. Is it true there's only those two possibilities? So think about that question just for a couple minutes. So what it means is, yeah, it must either be one of those, and if it's not either one with the aggregates or different from the aggregates, then that means it can exist. There's no other way for it to exist. So is that true? Mm. So then let's check the first possibility. So again, make sure you have a sense of that I you're looking for, right? The I that seems to exist from its own side. That we got a sense of in the first step. So that I, is it one with my aggregates or the collection of my body and mind? It's the main question. So one um, um, absurd consequence is if that self is one with the body and mind, then just as the aggregates, these aggregates are multiple, right? There's many of them. Then the self would become many. It would be a case we have many selves. So is that, and then maybe a second one I'll just mention, and then you can analyze both, is that if the self were one with the body and mind, then it would make no sense to talk of my body or my mind or my aggregates, because they would be exactly the same thing. So therefore, you can just use those two reasons. Does it make sense that this self, this inherent, this self that seems to exist from its own side, that it's one with the body and mind? So then, if it seems like that self is not, okay, it's not one with the body and mind, it's something different. So if it exists in the way it appears, from its own side or inherently, if it's inherently existent, then if it's different from the body and mind, it has to be inherently different, right? Which means it has to be totally unconnected. It has to stand on its own without any regard to, without any relationship to the aggregates, the body and mind. So if we look for a self existing in that way, the self, the object of negation, existing in that way, inherently from its own side, as something different, totally disconnected, totally separate from our body and mind, then when we separate out, it's like take away your body, take away your mind, and then there should be something left, which is this I. So we can we find a self existing like that? Mm. So it's pretty clear when we separate out the body and mind, you can't find anything to point to and say, that's me, that's the person. And especially not a person existing from its own side. So finally, we should be left with this kind of conclusion that therefore, this thing that so clearly seemed to exist in the first step, when we try to identify the object of negation, this concrete, the existent self, then it doesn't exist. Why? Because it doesn't exist as the same as the aggregates, doesn't exist as something different from the aggregates. There's no third possibility. Therefore, it's just an illusion. It doesn't exist. It's a totally false appearance. Doesn't exist at all. And then we just try to remain in that kind of awareness of its not existing. Okay. So relax your attention there. And so Oris will do breakout rooms now. Let's do, I don't know how many people. So don't put me in one.
All right.
So 1, 2. Looks like we can just do 2, maybe, with 3 people each.
Okay. Let me do that.
Or if you can join one if you like. Can do. In which case, maybe it'd be better to do 3 with,
Should we
2
do
with
3 breakout rooms?
1 with 3. Yeah, maybe 3.
Let me-
Yeah. 2, 3. 2 with 2 people and 1 with 3 people. Yeah. So, any questions arisen from your discussions?
I have a
Yes,
question.
Mary. Mhm.
My question is like I guess I kind of continuously thinking of myself as a dependent arising. So I'm having trouble thinking or coming to the point that I'm not my aggregates because like because like I understand, like I can understand that I'm not different, or separate from my aggregates, but I'm having trouble with that I'm not the same as my aggregates. Like if I'm not the same as my aggregates, then then what am I? So it's just a little confusing.
Mm-mm.
So is the mind, is that considered one of the aggregates?
The mind, yes.
So if you're not your mind, then how can you say you're not the same as your aggregates if your mind is, I'm confused.
Yeah, no. Good. Yeah, well, first of all, I think you're talking more about just the ordinary person that exists, that is a dependent arising.
If
Right.
that's not there, then what are you? I mean,
No. Yeah. So let's just talk about that a minute. So yeah, we are a dependent arising, independence, and we exist independence upon our body and our mind. Right. But the thing is, how are we related to our body and mind? How do we exist independence upon our body and mind? So first of all, like, I mean, are you clear that you're not, I mean, are you your body?
I would say yes. I mean, my first answer would be to say yes.
Yeah. So why would you say yes?
I have no other experience of anything except being my body and my mind.
But then, do you possess your body?
Well,
Is
that's
it is
because you don't have control over your body because you age, and if you had control, if you possessed your body, and you owned it, you could,
yeah, like, so do you control your body? No. I wish we did, right? Do you make choices about what to do to your body?
yes, like to eat
Yeah.
or to sleep.
Yeah, to eat, to sleep, to dress, to wash, and so forth. So in that way, and I mean, in that sense, it seems like, okay, we're something different from our body. We control it, we make choices about it, we do things to it. In that sense, it seems like we're different. But then in another sense, it seems like we are our body. Like when someone touches us, we say, "You're touching me." So when something happens to our body, like something strikes our leg or something, it struck me. It happens to us. When we feel some pain in our body, we say, I feel pain, right? So at that time, we're associating with our body more. But then other times we can disassociate from our body and we can associate ourselves more with our mind. Like, if we're thinking about something, we say, I'm thinking about this, right? Exactly as our mind is doing the thinking, but we label we associate with the mind. So the problem is, like, does your body think, for example? Like, if we are our body, then it means we don't think, because our body doesn't do thinking, right? Our body is just something physical. So our body can't think about the future or think about, like, what is 5 times 7. Our body can't think about that.
Can't you say that you exist in dependence upon the compilation of your aggregates, like without dividing them up? Wouldn't that be
Can we say we exist in dependence upon the compilation of the aggregates?
together as a unit?
Yes, that is how we exist. Yeah, we exist in dependence upon the compilation of the aggregates. But the real difficulty is, like, distinguishing the basis of imputation from the thing that's imputed upon it. So the aggregates, the collection of our body and mind, are our basis of imputation, which means they're like a collection of parts. Upon that, we impute self, right? So sometimes I impute more strongly on the body, like when, you know, I'm doing something physical and I say I'm sitting, I'm eating, then I'm looking more at my body and then imputing I upon the body. I'm associating more closely with the body. Sometimes when I'm doing something mental, let's say I know I'm reading, I'm thinking about this, I'm planning for that, I'm remembering this, then I'm associating myself more with the mind. But like if I am my mind, then nobody can see me, nobody can touch me. Just like nobody can see or touch our mind. It doesn't have color or shape or weight or anything. I don't have any weight. If I'm my body, then I can't think or remember or, you know, plan for the future or, you know, so we're not either our body or a mind. We're something labeled upon the collection of body and mind, right?
So, but if you take it as a collection, then how do you get to the point of saying that you're not one with your body and mind? Like, how do you make the leap to say that you're
Well,
not?
so we're not saying well, that's a different question. What we have to, when we're doing this analysis, when we're checking if we're, you know, one with our body and mind or different from body and mind, we're not looking for the conventional I, the one we're talking about now. We're looking for the object of negation, right? The inherently existent I, which actually it doesn't exist, but it appears that it exists, right? So that's why the first step is so important, where we have to check how is it that when we ordinarily, you know, just think about ourselves without analyzing, does it seem like, do we appear as if we're merely something labeled upon the body and mind? No, it looks like there's a real I that's just there, you know, independent of, not depending upon, separate from the body and mind, just really is there. So that's the one we're looking for, right? Not the, yeah. Okay, better, let's, yeah, maybe Bei and then Jorge.
Yeah, I think we were discussing about that, and I guess at least we like to use the term ego, because that's kind of like the thing that we that comes up, at least for me, like when I have strong emotion. It's almost that reifying of myself. But also, I think there was a question that I discussed with Jan was so once we come to the conclusion that this, say, so-called ego is not it's merely imputed on the aggregates, then what happened? It's like that maybe it's softened that concept that we have, but I'm not sure if it's really like gone. But I guess just trying to get there. Like, yeah, maybe that's my question. Maybe it's.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, it is helpful to think about it, that the object of negation as the ego, because it's true, the ego, I mean, when we're egoistic, when we're self-centered, when afflictive emotions arise, it is kind of the ego. It's this exaggerated sense of self, basically. Exaggerated sense of the reality or the concreteness of the self. That's what we're trying to negate. So it can be helpful to when you're doing the analysis to think about it like that, like this is my ego. But it's important to just keep in mind how it appears in a false way, right? In a mistaken way, in a way that it actually doesn't exist in that way. But then, yeah, so the point of the analysis though, so I would suggest also read Pabonko Rinpoche's presentation. Now, he goes through this analysis, and I'll send out today or tomorrow the page numbers, but there's the analysis of the, I don't know, selflessness of persons in his, and so he gives quite a good description of how this kind of you progress once you find it doesn't exist. But the basic thing is, basically we have to habituate ourselves to realizing that we don't exist in this way, right? That this ego It doesn't exist in the way it appears. And that by remembering, doing the analysis and remembering that, ascertaining that, being clear about that again and again and again, then it gradually loosens this kind of self-centeredness that we have. It loosens this sense of just the that I is primary and more important than anything else. We gradually come to see that I is just, it's just something imputed by my mind on my aggregates, which are infinitely interconnected with everything else, basically. So the sense of being an interconnected, interdependently arising phenomena, which is connected with the rest of the world and everybody else, increases. So the sense of identifying with others, identifying, with other people, the rest of the world, increases, right? So then it's easier to generate compassion, kindness, altruistic minds, generosity, and so forth. Yeah, Jorge, we're already over time, but I'll try to.
Just quick 2 questions and good morning again. The first part really quick. So is it correct to say that the I is the same thing as the ego in terms of like a philosophy where you have like the super ego and the id, which makes you? Is that correct to like make that cinnamon?
Super ego and the id, I'm not sure about those, like what
Like-
those exactly mean.
Like so your ego is comprised of like the things you want and the things you don't want, and they make yourself into like the person who you are. So is it correct to say that the I is the ego? Is it correct to make that?
Well, yeah, see, the problem with talking about ego and then super I and id is that it's like we're mapping 2 different conceptual worlds, right? We have
Okay.
the Buddhist philosophy kind of worldview, and then like the Western kind of Greek, Roman based worldview. And they each have their own different terms. And when we try to mix them, I mean, it's good to try to compare them, but we have to be really careful that we know exactly what we're talking about with each term. Otherwise, we just get a jumble of ideas. So that is the problem with ego. I mean, ego has many different meanings, right, and connotations. But it can be useful to help because it is related to what we're talking about, this exaggerated sense of self,
Okay.
right, is what we're talking about. But I think your main question was, what is the I actually? Is it the super? Is it the ego?
So like it was a 2-part question. The first
Oh,
one is
it's
it
short
fine?
though.
Yeah, it's short. Is it fine to say that the ego is the I? Like, and if it is,
No,
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 okay.
no, no. Because the ego, so when we say ego, though, it's more like we're really talking about a sense of self, right? But the I that we are is not just a sense of self. It's a real thing, right? It's not just a sense of something. Like the I does exist.
Mhm.
It's just the way we're talking. Our question is, well, how does it exist? I mean, that's the question. That's the real question we have to be asking ourselves all the time. How do I exist?
Okay.
Right? In every situation, all the time. That is the main question. Like, what am I? How do I, the person, what am I? How do I exist? So what Buddhism is essentially saying is the way we exist is as something much more ephemeral and interconnected, interdependent than we ordinarily perceive, right? So the way we exist essentially is by the power of imputation, concepts, or something that we conceive as existing on the basis of our body and mind. And so we're imputed upon, or something merely labeled upon our body and mind. We don't exist in any more substantial way than that. Well, the problem is we have a sense of ourselves existing in a much more substantial way than that, right? We feel like we're something very real, concrete, solid, that just is there, is real, completely apart from any concepts, any parts, any causes and conditions or something. It just is there. And that is kind of the ego, is the one that grasps at that sort of concrete self as being something real. Whereas what we're saying here is it's not real. It's just a projection of our ignorance.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. So let's conclude there. I know it's a lot of kind of, there's a lot of difficult logic, no, that we have to go through. But you have to just go through the steps, become familiar with the steps, and just go through again and again, and think about, you know, wherever you have questions and doubts, spend more time thinking about that and trying to, you know, undo the knots and work it out for yourself. And then go back to reading, you know, the different readings and looking at the outlines, and then think about it again. Think about it again and again and again, and gradually, you know, clarify. But the main question, come back to this question again about like, what am I? How do I exist? Right. Okay. So let's just dedicate now. Think of whatever merit we've created. Then by the force of this positive energy, may all beings be free from every form of suffering and have every form of well-being up to full enlightenment. Okay. Thank you all. See you next week.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Venerable Lifts Out.
Thanks,
And,
Urs. Thanks, Venerable.
Thank you.